Hey, welcome everybody. Just going to give people a second just to jump in on the call, but then we will get started very shortly. All right, seems to be slowing down. I'll give it another 10 seconds or so, and then I'll dive in here. All right, I think everybody's in. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time tonight. I hope the information I'm going to present to you is helpful. I'm Drew Heilpern from Summit Educational Group. Before I dive in, just a couple quick logistical things. The first one is we are recording this. We'll try to get the link out to the recording tomorrow or on Wednesday, but I am going to cover a lot of ground tonight in a relatively short amount of time. Please don't feel like you have to hang on my every word. I'll obviously feel flattered if you do. But the real goal tonight is just at a high level that you have a better understanding in terms of what the standardized testing landscape looks like, and a little bit of context in terms of how colleges are now using these scores. So if you want to go back and rewatch or re-listen to any of this, you'll have access to the recording, so you'll be able to do that. Also, if you have any friends or colleagues who you think might be interested, definitely feel free to forward the recording of the link on to them. Also, I'm going to keep an eye on the time tonight, keep us moving, but I'll definitely try to leave time for questions at the end. If you have questions, please just type them in the Q&A box that you see on your screen. And again, at the end, I'll circle back and answer any questions that you have. Just in the interest of time, I will hold questions to the end, but don't hold back. If you have any questions as I'm working through this, definitely type them in the Q&A box as we proceed tonight. But three major goals for the presentation tonight. The first one is really just to put these tests in context for you. They are not the be-all end-all of the college admission process. Your students' lives do not depend on their SAT or ACT scores. Having said that, though, I don't want us to completely put our heads in the sand either around these tests because depending on the schools that ultimately end up on your students list, there are schools out there that will see the scores, consider the scores, put a little bit of weight on those scores. But anything we can do to keep these tests in perspective and not give them more life than they deserve is always helpful. And then second goal tonight, as the title suggests, we'll just do a deeper dive on the ACT and digital SAT, just so you have a better understanding of what these tests now look like and some context in terms of some of the differences between them. And then third goal tonight, I'm just going to end by talking about a testing plan at a high level. I'll give you some general guidelines, some things to think about as you're thinking about your student standardized testing plan. All right, so with that as a quick intro, let us dive in here. So I start with this slide. I start here because this is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these really are just tests. Again, not the be all end all of the college admission process. And what we're looking at here is just some of the different factors that are going to go into your student's final admission decision. But the main point that I want you to have from this slide is please keep in mind that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is the student's grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. Next thing they're going to look at is what's called strength of curriculum. You'll also hear this referred to as rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves academically? Did they take advantage of the academic opportunities presented to them at their high school? And then for those schools that look at or consider standardized testing scores, the two major tests that they're going to look at are either the SAT or the ACT. Colleges accept both these tests equally. So at the end of the day, it's really up to your student to decide if they want to go down an SAT path or go down an ACT path. If your student's in AP classes and taking AP exams in May and chooses to submit those scores as part of their application, colleges will see those scores, consider those scores in that overall application read. But even those colleges that are getting, for instance, like 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 plus applications now. They are reading the student essays that are part of those applications. They absolutely are reading your student's counselor and teacher recommendations. They are looking at your students' extracurricular activities, any position of leadership they've had, any work experience they may have had. And all of these factors are going to go into that final admission decision. And for those of you going through the college process for the first time, the term that you'll hear is what's called a holistic review. And what the college admission officers are doing with that holistic review is they're really trying to get to know the applicant as a person, not just as a number. So they're not just going to take a student's grades or GPA and put it in some kind of formula with their SAT or ACT scores and then make that admission decision based on that number. With this holistic review, all of these factors are going to go into that final admission decision. And I do just want to take a minute just to talk about the test optional school landscape, just so you have a better understanding in terms of what it looks like now and what it means for our students. So I'll start by saying I know that there are some schools that have gone back to requiring standardized testing. And when they made these announcements, they did get a lot of publicity for going back to requiring standardized tests. But I do want to just point out that roughly 80 to 85% of colleges and universities have continued their test optional policies. So when your student applies to a test optional school in the fall of their senior year, what that means is kind of what the name implies is that they're in control of their standardized testing scores. So they decide whether to submit those scores as part of their application or not. So just in the fall of senior year, they're looking at their SAT or ACT scores. They feel good about those scores. They feel like those scores are reflective of the work they've been doing day in and day out in school. They feel like those scores will be supportive of their application, even though they are applying to a test optional school. By all means, they'll include those scores. Those college admission officers will see those scores, consider those scores in their overall application read. But just if for whatever reason, right? Those scores came back a little bit lower than what that student was hoping for or expecting, just really not in line with what they're capable of academically. They are not obligated to send that score to that test optional school. Most importantly, that college admission officer is not going to see that score. They're also not going to try to guess in terms of what that score may have been. They don't have time for that. So if your student applies to a test optional school without standardized testing scores, what that college admission officer is probably going to do, a little bit of a deeper dive on those grades, on that transcript, on that rigor, just to reassure themselves that that student can handle the rigors of that particular college or university. And again, roughly 80 to 85% of colleges and universities have continued their test optional policies. So we can say with a high degree of confidence, whether your student's a ninth grader, a 10th grader, or even an 11th grader, they absolutely are still going to be applying in this test optional environment. Now, there are some exceptions. So there are some schools that have gone back to requiring standardized testing. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a feel for the type of schools that have gone back. So, this is where we find the Harvards of the world, the Stanfords of the world, the Dartmouths of the world. Also, if your student happens to be looking at larger state universities, particularly in the South, like University of Florida, University of Georgia, University of Texas at Austin, for instance, just note that these schools have also all gone back to requiring standardized testing. But knowing there's going to be a number of schools on your student's final list that are test optional, I really encourage students to see these tests almost as a chance to show off a little bit. It's one more objective data point that they can potentially share with colleges to show their academic college readiness. But knowing that they're going to be in control of their scores to a number of schools on their list, I really want them to see these tests with this kind of everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. Now, there are some caveats to the test optional landscape just to be aware of. The first one is if your student's looking at some of those more or most selective test optional schools, and I'm thinking about like the Duke universities of the world here or the University of Chicago's for instance, we are seeing the percent of applicants applying to these types of institutions with standardized testing scores is starting to tick back up. Also, if your student happens to be a recruited athlete, depending on the sport, depending on the league, depending on the college, depending even possibly on the coach, we are still hearing from some of our coaches from test optional schools that they are still asking for standardized testing scores as part of the athletic recruitment process. And the reason for that is Just, I think those colleges and universities want to ensure that their college coaches are recruiting student athletes that meet a certain academic standard or threshold, and standardized testing scores might be still part of that recruitment process. But if your student is a recruited athlete from a test optional school, they can always just check in with the coach. So they can just ask the coach, "Hey, am I going to need standardized testing scores as part of this process?" And the coach will be able to tell them yes or no. And the coach also should be able to give your student a range of scores. They should be able to give them a feel for kind of where they want that score to ultimately come in. And the third caveat around this test optional landscape is just around this idea of merit scholarship awards. So, what a merit scholarship award is, it's generally a non-need based financial aid award. For those colleges that give merit scholarships, they're using it as a recruitment tool. So they are trying to entice strong students to apply and hopefully ultimately enroll at their institution. And the reason why I talk about merit scholarships here under this kind of test optional umbrella is just be aware that there are schools out there that admit test optionally, but when they consider these merit scholarship awards, they might still be factoring in standardized testing scores. Now, the college admission officers, they try to be as upfront and transparent in their policies as they can be. So if your student's looking at a test optional school that you know gives merit scholarship awards, they can always just ask them, do they consider standardized testing scores in those awards or not? And they'll give you an honest answer in terms of what their policies are. And then the last point that I want to make around the test optional landscape is just around this idea of strategic submission. So, what strategic submission means is, let's say, for instance, in the fall of senior year, or your student has 8 test optional schools on their list. With strategic submission, your student doesn't have to decide, okay, I'm going to send my scores to all 8 of my test optional schools or to none of my test optional schools. They can actually decide on a school by school basis whether to submit those scores or not. So, in our hypothetical example here, they might ultimately decide, you know what, I feel good about my scores to these 6 test optional schools, so I'm going to go ahead and send them. But maybe for whatever reason, I'm going to hold my scores back from these 2 test optional schools on my list. And you can see kind of pre-pandemic, only about 4% of students were classified as strategic submitters. Then with COVID and almost all colleges going test optional, you can see that percent of students went up about sixfold. You know, just as students more kind of learned about this policy and were taking advantage of it. Next time this survey is done, I think we're going to be well over kind of 60-70% of students as being classified as strategic submitters. Again, just as more and more students nationally learn about this and know that they can take advantage of this policy. But this idea of strategic submission, it dovetails nicely with that philosophy that I want students to have in terms of looking at these tests through that everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. Not only are students in control of their scores to their test optional schools, but with strategic submission, they are in control of those scores on that school by school basis. And again, I'm going to hit you with a lot of information tonight in a relatively short amount of time. But if you only remember one slide from this entire presentation tonight, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan, it's answering 3 pretty straightforward questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? And if your student has these questions answered ahead of time, it's just going to reduce some of the anxiety that always seems to surround standardized testing. Just students knowing when they need to have these tests on their radar and when they need to be thinking about them can go a long way in terms of reducing some of that anxiety. And I'll come back to these points around the testing plan, but I do want to make them now. The first one is, especially for our younger students, you know, like our 9th graders and our 10th graders, I know that there's huge pressure on them for early and often testing. Right? Just keep testing, 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 and start that process earlier, earlier, and earlier. But please keep in mind that performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. Everything that students are learning day in and day out in school is helping them prepare for these tests. So what that means is statistically speaking, most students are going to peak on these tests kind of later in spring of junior year, possibly even into that fall of senior year. And when students are most ready to take these tests, that's when I want them to take them. And the other point around the testing plan is at the end of the day, that quote perfect testing plan, it's going to be customized for your student. So it's really what's going to work best for them. So please do not worry. If your student's ultimate testing plan ends up looking a little bit different than what a best friend is doing or what a neighbor is doing, or possibly even what an older sibling ended up doing, there's many paths to success here. It's really what's going to work best for your student. All right, so now as we start doing a deeper dive in terms of what the standardized testing landscape looks like, I'm going to start by talking about this newer digital adaptive PSAT and SAT. So both the PSAT and the SAT, they're no longer paper and pencil tests. They've moved to this online forum and for students to take these tests. The first thing that they're going to have to do is they're going to have to download the Blue Book app. And I will say the College Board put a lot of time and effort into developing this app. I'll show you in a minute just some screenshots of what taking an online test for students looks like. But they did put a lot of resources into developing this app. And this app is what students need in order to take an official PSAT. And if they end up going down the SAT path, an official SAT farther down the line. But the other point that I want to mention about the Blue Book app is once students have downloaded the app and they sign into the app with their official College Board account login, they also get access to full-length practice tests. So for on the SAT side, I think it's now up to 8 or 9 full-length adaptive practice tests that students have access to. And on the PSAT, I think it's up to now 2 full-length practice tests, again, that students can access. Here at Summit, we've developed 4 adaptive SAT tests, so definitely feel free to reach out to us for those as well. But for students who are self-motivated and want to do some self-study, that's a great resource for them. And here's what taking the test online actually looks like for students. And I will say, students, they're completely in their element taking a test like this online. They are not fazed by it at all. And as I mentioned, the College Board, they did put a lot of time and effort into developing this platform. It is a pretty user-friendly experience for students as they are navigating their way through both the PSAT and the SAT. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to walk you through some of the features that the platform has, it has, for instance, this annotate button here. So if students click on this, it's going to bring up a highlighting tool so they can highlight parts of a passage. It also brings up an annotation box so students can take notes if they would like to. The other nice feature that it has is it has this answer eliminator here. So we know anytime students are taking a multiple choice test, process of elimination is always helpful. So as students are working their way through questions, if they decide that a certain answer choice is incorrect, they can use the answer eliminator to strike that answer choice out. If they change their mind, they can unstrike it out and bring that answer choice back. The other nice feature that it has is this mark for review button here. So let's say, for instance, a student's 50-50 on a question, and they know if they have time in this section, they want to come back to this question. They can mark it for review because then when they come down here where it says question 1 of 27, if they click on that button, what that's going to bring up is a dashboard of all the questions in that section. So at a glance, students can easily see every question that they've answered. any question that they've skipped, and any question that they've marked for review. So even though it's an online test, it is very easy for students to navigate from question to question throughout the test. They also have built in this timer here, so students know exactly how much time they have left in a section. For those students who are like, Drew, you've got to be kidding me. Like, it's the last thing I want to see is like this timer counting down on me. Students can hide the timer. They can unhide it and bring it back so they know exactly how much time they have left in that section. But this is what the online test on the verbal side of things looks like. For the math, it looks very similar. So here's our answer eliminator. Here's our mark for review. Here's our dashboard tab. Here's our timer. But the other nice feature that the Blue Book app has for both the PSAT and the SAT, for every single math question that students are going to see, it has this built-in calculator icon. And when students click on this icon, what it's going to bring up is a Desmos graphing calculator. And again, students have access to this Desmos graphing calculator on every single math question that they are going to see. And for those of you who are familiar with Desmos, you know it is a very powerful graphing calculator tool. So for students who have some exposure to Desmos and some comfort level using it, it can be very, very helpful in answering some of the math questions that they are going to see. Having said that, students can absolutely bring in their own graphing calculator as well. So they can use that in lieu of the Desmos calculator or in addition to. And it is an online test. So for the math sections of these tests, students are given scratch paper. So they're not expected to do everything in their head or do everything on their calculator. They absolutely can write things down on that scratch paper. And we highly encourage students to take advantage of that. But this is what taking the math sections for both the PSAT and the SAT online through the Blue Book app looks like. Okay, so now as we continue our deeper dive on the standardized testing landscape, I do just want to take a minute just to talk about the PSAT. So the PSAT, it really is just practice for the SAT. Colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make any admission decisions based on PSAT scores. Anytime students are given an opportunity to take an official test under real conditions, especially when it doesn't really count for anything, it's always good practice for them. And I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through the scoring of the PSAT because it can lead to a little bit of confusion. But the SAT still very much on that 200 to 800 point scale. So 200 to 800 on the math, 200 to 800 on the verbal. Whereas the PSAT, as you can see here, the PSAT is on a 160 to 760 scale. So especially for our juniors, when they get their PSAT scores back in the fall of junior year, and they figure out that the PSAT is out of 760 instead of out of 800, often the question we'll get is something along the lines of, all right, Drew, so does that just mean I can add 40 points to my PSAT verbal score and 40 points to my PSAT math score, and that would be my SAT score? And you can kind of tell by the tone of my voice and the way in which I'm talking about this. But the answer to that is unfortunately no, they cannot. And the reason for that is you can kind of get a sense for this the way this slide is organized. But these tests are all what they're called vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT because it is the score your student would have gotten had they taken an SAT on that day. So for instance, if they got a 550 on the PSAT verbal, 550 on the PSAT math, that 1100 would be their SAT score. The reason why the PSAT goes to 760 instead of 800 is this is in some ways the College Board acknowledging that students are taking the PSAT a little bit early. So they're taking it again in fall of junior year. They're not going to peak on this until potentially late spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. So those hardest math questions, for instance, in that 760 to 800 point range that are on the SAT, they are just not on the PSAT. So that's why it's cut off at 760. Similarly, on the PSAT in this 160 to 200 point range, there's some easier questions on the PSAT that just aren't on the SAT. But again, with that vertical alignment, students can still use the PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT because it is the score they would have gotten had they taken an SAT on that day. But I always try to remind juniors, right? Keep in mind, right, when you get your PSAT scores back, don't worry or don't panic if those PSAT scores aren't exactly kind of where you were hoping, or they came in a little bit lower than what you were hoping for or expecting. Again, because of that age, maturity, and time spent in school, where you start on a PSAT and where you ultimately end up on an SAT or an ACT for that matter, is often two different places. But it does give you a baseline score. It does give you a general sense in terms of kind of where you're starting in this process. All right, so now as we start doing a deeper dive, the two major tests that the colleges are looking for are either this digital adaptive SAT or the ACT. Please keep in mind that colleges accept both these tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. They do not see one test as a superior test and the other test as an inferior test. They are accepted equally. So what that means is really at the end of the day, it's up to your student to decide, do I want to go down an SAT path or do I want to go down an ACT path? And here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests. And just looking at this slide, you do get the sense that there is some overlap in terms of content between these tests. But the tests themselves are very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. So the SAT is more of what we call a power test, just harder reading on that SAT, just trickier questions. There's more misdirection on that SAT, just trying to make things seem harder than they actually are. Whereas the ACT, the reading's a little bit easier. The questions are a little bit more straightforward, but the difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. So most students who walk out of an ACT, or ideally a practice ACT for the first time, often their reaction is something along the lines of, Drew, you know what? I actually didn't think that ACT was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it. But that's where the difficulty of the ACT comes from. Most students feel rushed on it. Most students feel like they don't have the time they truly need to hit their full potential on that test. In terms of the scoring on the SAT, 200 to 800 on the verbal, 200 to 800 on the math. So it's still on that 400 to 1600 point scale. If you're not familiar with the ACT, it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's divided up into different sections. There's an English section, that's the grammar portion of the test. Then there's a math section. Then there's a reading section. Then there's this science section on the ACT. Don't get thrown off by the word science. It's not science per se. It's not like what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's more of a scavenger hunt than anything. Students are given scientific passages. They might not know anything about those passages, but the idea of it is can they work their way through them to find the information that they need contained in those passages to answer the science-related questions that they are being asked. The reason why the science section is in orange here is one of the changes that the ACT recently made to their test to try to shorten their test to kind of compete with the 2 hour and 14-minute digital SAT test is they've made the science section now optional. So if your student ends up going down the ACT path, when they register for an official ACT, they will be given the option of taking the ACT with the science section or not. In terms of our recommendation is where we are right now is if your student again ends up going down the ACT path, our recommendation is to take the ACT with science at least once. That way they have a science score if they need it, because there are still some colleges out there that are requiring the ACT science. So for example, Boston University. Even though Boston University is test optional, if your student submits an ACT score as part of their application, BU will only look at that ACT score if a student has taken a science section and has a science score to report. So kind of that's where our recommendation comes from. It's more of a hedge than anything. I'd rather have students take the ACT with science and have a science score in case they need it than not take it with science. And then maybe in the fall of senior year, they add BU to their list and now maybe they're scrambling to take the ACT one more time just for the sake of getting this a science score. You can see on the ACT, there's also this optional writing or optional essay at the end of it. Students don't need to register for the ACT with that optional writing. Colleges aren't looking at that writing score. They're really not doing anything with it. So if you end up going down the ACT path, our recommendation, take it with this science at least once. That way you have a science score if you need it, but don't worry with the optional writing. You are not going to need that optional writing score. Again, if you're not familiar with the ACT, the scoring takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's on a 1 through 36 scale. So what colleges will see is they'll see the individual subsection scores, and then they'll also see what's called the composite score. And the composite score is just the average of the English, math, and reading scores. With the science being optional now, that science score is just a standalone score that colleges can see if they're interested in it. But that science score is not going to be factored in to that overall composite score. All right, so I've mentioned a couple times how both the PSAT and the SAT have moved to this adaptive scoring structure. So I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through this, just so you have a better understanding in terms of how this scoring works. So at the 30,000 foot view, when I talk about an adaptive test, what I mean by that is how students perform on an earlier part of the test predicts their overall scoring range, and then the questions that they see later in that test are going to be used to refine or hone in terms of what that student's actual score is. So before I walk you through this, I do just want to go back to this slide just to orient us. And again, the PSAT and the SAT, they have this identical adaptive scoring structure. But on the verbal part of the SAT, for instance, is divided up into two, what I'm going to call modules. So module one on the reading and writing, then module two on the reading and writing, then module one on the math, and then module two on the math. And what students are going to see in that first module, and this is true of both the verbal and the math first modules, is think of this as being like a heat map of level of difficulty of questions. But in that first module, students are going to get some easy questions. They're going to get middle level questions. They're going to get some hard questions. They're going to get some of the hardest questions on this test. And then depending on how well students do in that first module, the test is going to send them to one of two second modules. So let's say a student did quote well in that first module. And we think by doing well, it's answering about 60 to 65% of the questions correctly. Again, once they finish that first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And what the test has figured out is based on that student's performance is that this student is somewhere in the 450 to 800 point range. But the test doesn't know where in that range that student is. Is this a 450, a 550, a 650, a 750, or even an 800 level student? So to figure out where in that range that student lies in this quote harder second module, kind of as the name implies, what students are going to get is they're going to get hard questions, harder questions, some of the hardest questions on this test to figure out where in that range that student is. Let's say a student struggled with that first module. Let's say they answered about 50% of the questions correctly. Again, once they've finished that first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And what the test has figured out is based on that student's performance is that this student is somewhere in the 200 to low 600 point range. But to figure out where in this range this student is, they're going to get in this easier module, easy questions, mostly middle level questions. There might be the occasional hard question or two, again, to figure out where in this range that student is. And we think by low 600s, it's kind of like 620 or 630 range on the high end. But just note, if a student ends up in this easier second module, their score is going to be capped. So we think the highest score that student can get get is somewhere in kind of that 620 to 630 range. Now, going into the adaptive SAT, students know that it has this structure, but we generally advise students just not to worry about it. So when they've completed the first module, even though the test knows which second module the student is being sent to, the students don't know. So the test isn't going to tell them whether they went to the harder module or the easier module. And I just don't want students wasting any mental energy as they're getting into that second module, trying to guess which one they think they got sent to. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests really comes down to answering as many of these questions as they can correctly. So I'd much rather have students kind of stay present, live in the moment, answer the questions that are in front of them, and not spend any mental energy trying to guess which second module they got sent to. Also note on the PSAT score report, it's also not going to tell your student whether they went to a harder module or the easier module. On the SAT score report that you get back and on the official SAT score report that you send on to colleges, also not going to say whether students went to the harder module or the easier module, because you can see there is some overlap in scoring between these two modules in that kind of 450 to low 600 point range. So let's say a student got a 550 on their SAT math. They could have gotten a 550 by going to the harder module. They could have gotten a 550 by going to the easier module, but it does not matter. A 550 is a 550 regardless of which second module that student got sent to. But I did just want to take a minute just to walk you through the adaptive scoring structure for the SAT. Again, just so you have a better understanding in terms of what this looks like. But it's because of the adaptive scoring that the SAT was able to move from a 3 hour and paper and pencil test to a 2 hour and 14 minute adaptive SAT test. So they chopped 45 minutes off of it, but can still have it on that same 200 to 800 point scale and can still have a valid test. Now, just note the ACT, talking to the ACT folk, they have no interest in moving to an adaptive scoring structure. The ACT is still very much kind of a paper and pencil test. So it is just another important difference between these two tests. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to walk you through some sample questions from the SAT and from the ACT, just to give you a better feel in terms of how that power of the SAT differs from that speed of the ACT. Do not worry, we're not actually going to solve any of these questions. I'm not going to unmute any of you and call on you to answer them. It's really for illustrative purposes only. But the other major change that the SAT made when it went to this adaptive format is on the verbal side, it redefined what a passage is. So on the SAT, passages are no longer kind of these long essays that students need to fight their way through. The passages are much shorter now. So generally something like this, usually a paragraph or two. And then there is only one question per passage. But just because the passages got shorter, it doesn't mean the reading got easier. Still a power test, so still requires a close reading, analytical reading, almost a line by line reading of this passage in order to be able to answer this question. But this is just an example of a grammar question from the SAT. For the ACT, the grammar is tested in that first section, that ACT English section. Students are given much longer passages, as you can see here. And really what the assignment is as students are working their way through these passages, they have to correct the grammatical errors as they come across them. Passages on the ACT, again, much longer, but the difficulty is the pace of it. Students have to work pretty quickly to get through all of these passages, to get through this section in the time allotted. But because it's more of a power test, more of a speed test, it just doesn't require kind of that close reading, deep reading, analytical reading that SAT is going to require. And also the passage is just a little bit more straightforward. It's more of like a peer editing assignment than anything. They're trying to write passages in the voice of what a typical high school student might write. So on the verbal side of the SAT, in addition to the writing or the grammar questions, there's also reading comprehension questions. Here's just an example here. Again, passages are much shorter, but we get an excerpt from a 19th century British novel that students need to fight their way through. Again, being a power test still requires a close reading, analytical reading of this passage in order to be able to answer that question. On the ACT reading, the passages look like this, so much, much longer. To give you a feel for this, this passage this is about a third of what the passage actually looks like. But again, the difficulty of the ACT is the pace of it. So on the ACT reading, students have four of these long passages. There's 9 questions per passage and 36 questions in total, but students only have 40 minutes to get through this entire passage or this entire section. So again, gives you a feel in terms of how fast-paced that ACT reading section is. But because of the fast-paced nature of it, just kind of more questions along these lines. The passage points to this. In that limited amount of time, can students show that they read and understood the passage, understood that central argument that that author was trying to make? It just doesn't require that kind of deep reading, close reading, analytical, line by line reading that that SAT passage is going to require. Which then brings us to everyone's favorite topic on these tests, the math. These are both slope of the line questions, and I chose them because, again, I think they do a nice job of highlighting that difference between the power of the SAT with that speed of the ACT. And you can see the SAT question on your screen. I'm not going to read it to you. But most students kind of have the same reaction that we all have when we encounter an SAT question like this, which is generally like, Drew, like, what on earth? Like, I have no idea. Like, I have no idea what this question is even asking me, let alone trying to figure out how to solve it. So the SAT, they could have asked this question in a much more straightforward way. They could have just simply said, the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0, 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And had they worded it that way, most students would read that and be like, oh, it's asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I totally know how to do that. But this is where the misdirection comes in. For students to figure out that this is all this question is asking, they have to figure out this whole a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b and how it relates back to that earlier part of the question. Whereas the ACT, just way less interested in playing that misdirection game, just much more straightforward of a question. Students are given 2 lines. One of the lines has the slope of 3. They're then asked to find the slope of that perpendicular line. Now, you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes, or you don't. If you do remember it, you know the answer choice is C, -1/3. If you don't remember that, you're kind of just choosing your favorite ACT letter here and moving on to that next question. There's no getting inside the test taker's head. There's no trying to figure out what this question is actually asking you. You either know it or you don't. Again, that difference between the speed of the ACT with that power on that SAT. Which then brings us to this optional science section. Again, our general recommendation is for students, if they go down the ACT path, to take the science at least once. That way they have a science score if they need it. And I will say, the ACT science, it is designed to kind of overwhelm students. You know, most students who encounter the ACT science section for the first time, usually their reaction is something like, Drew, there's no way. There's no way in 40 minutes I'm going to be able to answer, roughly 36 science related questions that refers back to figures and graphs that look something like this. It's not actually as bad as it seems. Like, I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I don't actually need to know any of that in order to be able to answer this question. And this is what I mean when I say the ACT science is more of a scavenger hunt than anything. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core is approximately between. So really what it's asking me is, can I find the outer core? And I know the outer core is here between these 2 dashed lines. And then I know how to read a graph. So I know I'm the y-axis there. I know I'm between these 2 points here. So I know that answer choice is C. 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I have found. I have no idea what that answer choice actually means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students can struggle with the ACT. Because it is such a fast-paced test, the ACT has the tendency of turning on everyone's voice of self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes something like this, which is Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you absolutely sure that answer choice is C? Now, if I give into that voice, I am going to double check this or triple check this or even quadruple check this. And on the ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving them strategies and approaches, it's also about building up a student's confidence that they can see a question like this and without any hesitation or doubt, circle answer choice C and move on to that next question. Again, there is some overlap in terms of the content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of their philosophies, with the SAT being more of a power test. More challenging reading, more challenging questions, requires a deeper understanding, a narrower focus of skills, especially on the math, where roughly 70 to 80% of the math is algebra. So algebra 1 and algebra 2. Less than 10% is going to be geometry, but being a power test, just more time per question. Whereas the ACT being more of a speed test. Reading and questions are a little bit more straightforward. Does require that instant recognition, though, as we saw with that ACT slope of the line question and that ACT science question. Broader scope of skills, especially on the math, where only about 30% is algebra. So way more geometry on that ACT compared to the SAT. But again, the difficulty is the pace of it. Almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. Which then brings us to the $1,000,000 question. And the $1,000,000 question goes something like this, which is, all right, Drew. So we know colleges accept both these tests equally. So just earlier on in the process, if we can decide, right, are we going down an SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? It's just taking that potential amount of work and cutting it in half. But which test should we focus on? Should we go SAT? Should we go ACT? And I include this cartoon just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student's going to prefer the SAT. This type of student's going to prefer the ACT. At the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to try both tests, ideally in a practice setting. So that way students just aren't faced with the pressures for taking them for real. And then there is a concordance table, so we can compare an SAT score to an ACT score. And then here out of our Waltham, Massachusetts office, we run practice tests every single weekend, both Saturdays and Sundays. So definitely feel free if you're near our office to give us a call to have your student come in and do a practice test with us here. We also have our other office in New Canaan, Connecticut as well. But don't worry, if coming into one of our offices is not convenient for you, just reach out to us. We absolutely can make arrangements for students to take these tests at home. So here's the concordance table, just to give you a feel in terms of how an SAT score compares to an ACT score. And again, knowing that we can use a PSAT score as a baseline for the SAT, you can also take a PSAT score and just put that right in that table here. But just to orient us, because I know this table is a little bit small, 24 out of 36 on the ACT, the equivalent to about an 1180 out of 1600 on that SAT. And then 30 out of 36 on the ACT, the equivalent to about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. Keep in mind that roughly 80% of students are going to score equally well on both tests. So often the decision whether to go down an SAT path or to go down an ACT path, it can sometimes comes down to a student's gut instinct. Like we kind of joke with them, like which one did you kind of hate the least? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which test do you think plays to your strengths? Which test do you think is you're gonna have an easier time getting a score that's more reflective of the work you've been doing day in and day out in school? And then also reaching out to us to take advantage of our practice tests. The nice thing with those practice tests is in addition to the itemized scores. Students also get an itemized score report back that shows every question that they've answered correctly and every question that they've missed. So even when those test scores come back comparably, definitely reach out to our program directors, have a conversation with them, because we can do a deeper dive on those score reports. And even when those scores come back very, very similar, often depending on the types of questions that students are answering or students are missing, often we'll have a recommendation based on that deeper dive on that score report in terms of in terms of what we think of students having an easier time going down an SAT or potentially an ACT path. Okay, next part of that testing plan, just when should students be taking these tests? So here's when the tests are offered. And as you can see, with the exception of January, they are offered every single month. A couple years ago, ACT added a testing date in July, SAT added a testing date in August. So like, hooray, your students can take standardized testing or take standardized tests over the summer now too, if they would like to. But I cannot stress this enough. Please do not have this be your student standardized testing plan. Like, no one wants students to take these things like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. It's just too much. They have better things to do with their time. Also note that the scores don't just keep going up and up and up and up and up every time a student takes a test. At a certain point, we're going to see those scores plateau. At a later point, we can actually see those scores start to drop because burnout on these tests is real. Most students aren't one and done just because the first time they take the test, they're always a little bit nervous. But most students are going to peak on these tests after taking it twice, maybe a third time in that early fall of senior year as needed. And we just talked about this, but a little bit earlier on in the process, if they can do a practice SAT or a practice ACT, we're just going to try to choose a path, right? Because we're just trying to avoid going like ACT to SAT to ECT and then switch to SAT and then rinse, lather, repeat on that in that early fall of senior year. So we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, which might look something along these lines on the SAT. So for our 10th graders who are on the call, it's great that you're joining us. You do have a lot of time on this. So generally our advice is over the summer, reach out to us, try a practice SAT, try a practice ACT. Might be a little bit early to start prep, but we can start thinking about or mapping out a plan. Are we going down the SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? So one of our current juniors, they did that, scored equally well on both tests as many students do, had a slight preference for the SAT. So we ended up going down the SAT path. Again, PSAT in October just to get another practice under her belt. And then first official test in March of junior year, second one in June. Student was in AP classes or taking AP classes. So taking AP tests in May. So just wanted to build that into our timeline and then early fall of senior year. And again, I will say these are just sample testing plans just to give you a feel for it. Your students' actual testing plan will be customized for them. If you end up going down an ACT path, it might look something like this: April of junior year for their first attempt, June for their second attempt, again, AP exams in May, if applicable, and then early fall of senior year as needed. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, maybe something along these lines on the SAT side, maybe something along these lines on the ACT side. I will say for strong students who are comfortable taking standardized tests, and for our recruited athletes, just because coaches, are generally asking for scores a little bit earlier, we will move that timeline up. But generally speaking, if we move the timeline up, I'm kind of targeting sort of November, December, late fall of junior year for their first test. I just want students to get into junior year a little bit before they start taking an official test. All right, in the last couple minutes that I have here, I do just want to talk about superscoring, just so you're familiar with this term. So almost all colleges superscore the SAT. So what that means is if your student's taken the test more than once, what they will do is they will send in the two score reports that will lead to their highest super score. So in this case, the student would send on their full May score report and their full August score report, because what those colleges are going to do that are super scoring is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores from these two different administrations of the test and build what I call a Frankenstein score. So even though this student did not get a 1290 in a single sitting on their SAT, for those colleges that super score, and again, most do, that 1290 is going to be that student's SAT score. A couple of reasons why colleges super score. The first one is you got to keep in mind that colleges read applications supportively, and super scoring is one way in which they can look at the standardized testing piece in that most supportive light. The other reason why colleges are super scoring, we all kind of load the US News and World Report college rankings, but published SAT and ACT scores still factor into those rankings. So it is in a college's best interest to be able to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can, and super scoring is one way in which they can do that. And let me just reassure you, for those colleges that super score, they are in fact super scoring. They're not playing gotcha here. They're not trying to trick you into sending more score reports so they can see the 580 reading and writing, see the 640. They're not going to ask themselves which one's the real one. Should we average them together? They're going to take that 640 each and every time because it's in their best interest to do so. Colleges also super score the ACT. It works in the exact same way. This student took February and June of junior year and then September, early fall of senior year. The colleges are going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores from those different administrations and same story, recalculate that composite. So even though this student did not get a 32 in a single sitting on their ACT, for those colleges that super score the ACT, that 32 is going to be that student's ACT score. And again, with the science section being optional, the science score is no longer factored into that overall composite score or that overall super score. It is just a standalone score that colleges can see if they are interested in looking at that science score. Okay, last part of that testing plan, just how and when should students prepare for these tests. Just as I want students to do something sane and sensible on the testing side, I also want students to do something sane and sensible on any test prep that they might do. So depending on a student's starting score and their ultimate goal score, most students are looking at about 6 to 15 weeks of study and practice going into that first official test date. I just don't want students prepping for these things for like a year, year and a half, 2 years. It's just too much. I'd much rather do something a little bit shorter, a little bit more intensive maybe, and also build on what they're learning day in and day out in school. In terms of what goes into the prep, three major areas. So one is content. So knowing what's on the test, and our prep programs are based around these foundations. So one is content, right? So knowing what's on the test. So knowing all the grammar that's covered, knowing all the math. The other is strategy, just a game plan for every section and every question that they're going to see. And then taking full-length practice tests is just a great way for students to build up their stamina, get their pacing down, and get more comfortable with the types of questions that they are going to see on these tests. And just to give you a feel, again, in addition to customizing the testing plan, we'll also customize a test prep plan that's going to work best for your students. So definitely feel free to reach out to us if you are interested in that. All right, I know we covered a lot of ground tonight, but just to sum up what we've talked about, again, we can say with a high degree of confidence, whether your student's a 9th grader, a 10th grader, an 11th grader, they absolutely are still going to be applying in this test optional environment. So really encourage students to view these tests with that kind of everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. We do encourage students to take a practice SAT and ACT. Again, reach out to us for those a little bit earlier in the process. You get a baseline score, but more importantly, it helps us choose a path. Are we going down an SAT path? Are we going down an ACT path? And again, many schools on your final list will be test optional. So you'll be able to take advantage of that strategic submission so you can decide on that school by school basis whether to submit those scores or not. And then I just leave you with this note. We know that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is the students' grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. It doesn't do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say on this side of the computer, but really, these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. Your students are going to have many, many opportunities to showcase their academic abilities throughout their application. So I really encourage students to think about these tests again, more as a chance to show off a little bit. It's one more data point that they can potentially share with colleges to show that academic readiness. And again, I'm Drew from Summit. If you're not familiar with us, again, definitely reach out to us. Take advantage of our practice SAT and ACT tests. And as you get into this, if you're looking for a little bit more customized support, we do standardized testing tutoring. We also do academic tutoring. We do one-on-one AP tutoring as well. So definitely, as you get into this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you need anything. All right, let's see. My goal was to finish around 8 o'clock. It is 8 o'clock on the nose, so we will call that a win. We definitely have some time for questions, though. So as I'm pulling these up, though, obviously you can reach out to us at any time. But if you would like one of our program directors to reach out to you directly, definitely feel free to fill out this poll, and I will be sure to forward your information onto our program directors so they can reach out to you directly. But again, you can always call us or reach out to us as well. All right, we do have some time for questions, so let me just bring these up. Let's see, how many points do you get for each correct answer? So on the SAT, it's a little bit of a black box because they have not released, and I don't think they will, in terms of kind of what the adaptive scoring rules actually look like. The information we've gleaned from it is just going through those practice tests over and over and over and taking them in different ways to kind of see what scores we ended up getting. For the ACT, if you're interested in seeing like a more formal scoring chart, if you go online, the ACT has put out an official practice ACT, which you can see, and they actually have the scoring chart for that official practice ACT. So that will give you a feel in terms of like how many questions can I miss on the English and get a certain score. Again, it's a little bit more of a black box on the SAT side of things, but as you get into it and do some practice tests, you'll get a better sense in terms of kind of how that scores. So does the ACT also use the Blue Book app or a different digital platform? So they have their own platform. I think they call it Gateway, that they've developed, because the SAT and ACT, it's two separate tests, it's two separate organizations. And the ACT platform, digital platform, it's just not as quite as user friendly as the Blue Book app on the SAT side. So our general advice to students, if you end up going down the ACT path, is to still potentially take that paper and pencil, just because taking the digital test for the ACT, it is a little bit clunky. I mean, having said that, we've had students take it and they've done fine on it, but it's not quite as seamless a testing experience as students have had with the SAT. Let's see. When you're trying to decide which test to take, is there a preferred span of time to plan between practice SAT and practice ACT? I mean, that's a great question. There's no hard and fast rule on this. Generally speaking, we try to have students do the practice tests within like 2 or 3 weeks of each other. But if that timeline gets extended for whatever reason, it's totally fine. But that's generally kind of what we recommend. somewhere in that kind of two to 3 week range. So if students do a PSAT in October, we're generally encouraging students to kind of try a practice ACT kind of in early to mid to late November, if they can. But again, it's really just to get some practice and exposure to both tests. So do not worry if if that gap between practice tests is maybe a little bit longer. But the other extreme is I don't want students doing a full length practice, SAT on a Saturday, and then on that next day, Sunday, to do a full length practice ACT. It is a lot of testing for one weekend. So I do want students to kind of spread it out a little bit, just especially when they take the second one, that they feel a little bit more rested on that. But thank you for asking those questions there. All right, we definitely still have another minute or two, so definitely feel free if anything else comes to mind, and totally no worries if it doesn't. I know I hit you with a lot of information. All right, I think that's it in terms of questions coming in. Again, definitely feel free to fill out the poll that you can see on your screen. But of course, you can always reach out to us at any time as well. All right, not seeing any more questions come in, so we will end it on that. Again, we'll try to get the recording out to you either tomorrow or on Wednesday. But I hope this was helpful for you, and so appreciate everyone taking the time to join me tonight. All right, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. All right, take care.